For many decades, it's been widely accepted that alcoholism, or addiction, is a disease. The disease concept is taught in addiction training programs and to patients in treatment programs. It is unquestioned by public figures and the media. But is it true? And if it is not true, is there a better and more helpful way to define addiction? The prevalent theory in the United States, and to some degree in Australia, is that addiction is a chronic brain disease, a progressive, incurable condition that can be kept at bay only by fearful abstinence. There are variations of this disease model, one of which became the basis of 12-step recovery and the touchstone of the vast majority of rehab programs. Here is a brief history. In the bad old days, before the disease concept became widely popular, about 40 years ago, our society was even more prejudiced against people with addictions than it is now. Addicts were seen as different and worse than normal folks. They were thought to be lacking in ordinary discipline and morality, as self-centered and uncaring. They were seen as people who were out for their own pleasure without regard for anyone else. They were viewed as having deficiencies in character. Then came the idea that addiction is a disease, a medical illness like tuberculosis, diabetes or Alzheimer's disease. That meant that people with addictions weren't bad, they were sick. In an instant, this changed everything. Public perceptions were less judgmental. People were less critical of themselves. Of course, it wasn't welcome to hear that you had a disease, but it was better than being seen as immoral and self-centered. So, the disease concept was embraced by virtually everyone. With all its benefits, it's no wonder this idea continues to attract powerful, emotional support. Widespread enthusiasm for the disease model, however, has led to willingness to overlook the facts. Addiction has very little in common with diseases. It is a group of behaviors, not an illness on its own. It cannot be explained by any disease process. Perhaps worst of all, calling addiction a disease interferes with exploring or accepting new understandings of the nature of addiction. This becomes clear if you compare addiction with true diseases. In addiction, there is no infectious agent, as in tuberculosis, no pathological biological process, as in diabetes, and no biologically degenerative condition, as in Alzheimer's disease. The only disease-like aspect of addiction is that if people do not deal with it, their lives tend to get worse. That's true of lots of things in life that are not diseases. It doesn't tell us anything about the nature of the problem. It's worthwhile to remember here that the current version of the disease concept, the chronic brain disease neurobiological idea, applies to rats but has been repeatedly shown to be inapplicable to humans. Mark Lewis, a professor of developmental neuroscience at Radboud University in Nijmegen in the Netherlands, argues in his book, Why Addiction is Not a Disease, that addiction is the result of deep learning, probably triggered by stress or alienation. It can duly be unlearned by forging stronger synaptic pathways via better habits. The implication for the $35 billion treatment industry in the US is that tackling addiction as a medical issue should be only a small element of a more holistic approach. The problem is, there's a lot of vested interest, and financial investment, in perpetuating the disease model. According to Lewis, there is consensus on the science, at least, that repeated alcohol and drug use causes tangible changes in the brain. We all agree on that, he says. The changes are in the actual circuitry, within the synapses that connect the striatum to other parts. The longer a time that you spend in your addictive state, the more the cues attached to your drug or drink of choice is going to turn on the dopamine system, Lewis says. At the same time as the release of dopamine, nicknamed the feel-good chemical, is being ramped up, there is a decreased activity in areas of the brain responsible for judgment and decision-making. According to the globally influential, US-based National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, these neurobiological changes are evidence of brain disease. Lewis disagrees. Such changes, he argues, are induced by any goal-orientated activity that becomes all-consuming, such as gambling, sex addiction, internet gaming, learning a new language or instrument, and by powerfully valenced activities such as falling in love or religious conversion. And while the American Medical Association may have classified alcoholism as a disease in 1956 and obesity in 2013, it hasn't gone so far as to similarly smote love or Catholicism. It even applies to making money, Lewis says of this deep learning. There have been studies showing that people making high-powered decisions in business and politics also have very high levels of dopamine metabolism in the striatum, because they're in a constant state of goal pursuit. The result of constantly stimulating this reward system keeps the user focused only on the moment. You can't think about tomorrow or next week, says Lewis. You've lost the idea of yourself being on a line that extends from the past into the future. You're just drawn into this vortex that is the now. While the disease concept suggests that a person who has become abstinent will be in perilous remission forever, Lewis argues that new habits can override old. People have to really be ready, because there has to be a powerful surge towards other goals, says Lewis. Goals about their relationships and feeling whole, connected and under control. The striatum is highly activated and looking for those other goals to connect with. There was a study made on addicts of cocaine, alcohol and heroin, and it showed that 6 months to a year into their abstinence there were regions of the prefrontal cortex that had previously showed a decline in synaptic density from underuse, which had returned to baseline and then gone beyond baseline. That indicates growth of powerful new synaptic networks, and if you're setting up new paths then you're deactivating old paths, because they're being used less. Lewis certainly isn't the first scientist to believe that most people who become addicted are experiencing some kind of loneliness, depression or alienation. He cites psychologist Stanton Peele, who has table-thumped the idea since the 1970s that addiction is a learned behavior influenced by personal suffering, and neuropsychopharmacologist Carl Hart, who wrote a hair-raising memoir of his own and who insists drugs aren't the problem, rather it's draconian drug laws and marginalization. What's undeniable is that the disease concept they reject is deeply embedded into our culture, largely through Alcoholics Anonymous. There can be few American TV serials that haven't depicted a recovering alcoholic leaving their place in the circle of chairs, to attempt to control their own drinking. When the doomed character dramatically relapses in a bar, the message reinforces the Minnesota model of disease, adopted by AA in the 1950s, that alcoholism is an involuntary disability, not the symptom of an underlying problem. The first of AA's 12 steps states, "We admitted we were powerless over alcohol." And AA literature dictates that the reins be handed over to a higher power, at odds to Lewis' belief that sobriety requires self-empowerment. Even as a member diligently attends meetings in church halls, their disease is, it's said, doing push-ups in the parking lot. In other words, dare to stop attending meetings and it'll king hit you. As you likely know, addictive acts occur when precipitated by emotionally significant events. They can be prevented by understanding what makes these events so emotionally important, and they can be replaced by other emotionally meaningful actions or even other psychological symptoms that are not addictions. Addictive behavior is a readily understandable symptom, not a disease. But if we are to scrap the disease concept and replace it with something valid, our new explanation must retain all the beneficial aspects of the old disease idea. It must not allow moralizing or any other negative attributions to people suffering with addictions. In fact, we'd hope an alternative explanation would have more value than the disease label, by giving people with addiction something the disease concept lacks, an understanding that is useful for treating the problem. Knowing how addiction works psychologically meets these requirements. Recognizing addiction to be just a common psychological symptom means it is very much in the mainstream of the human condition. In fact, as I've described elsewhere, addiction is essentially the same as other compulsive behaviors like shopping, exercising, or even cleaning your house. Of course, addiction usually causes much more serious problems. But inside, it is basically the same as these other common behaviors. When addiction is properly understood to be a compulsive behavior like many others, it becomes impossible to justify moralizing about people who feel driven to perform addictive acts. And because compulsive behaviors are so common, any idea that addicts are in some way sicker, lazier, more self-centered, or in any other way different from the rest of humanity becomes indefensible. Seeing that addiction is just a compulsive symptom also meets our wish for a new explanation. Unlike the disease idea, it actually helps people to get well. When people can see exactly what is happening in their minds that leads to that urge to perform an addictive act, they can regularly learn to become its master, instead of the urge mastering them. Despite all its past helpfulness, then, we are better off today without the disease idea of addiction. For too long, it has served as a kind of black box description that explains nothing, offers no help in treatment, and interferes with recognizing newer ways to understand and treat the problem. And there is one more advantage. If we can eliminate the empty disease label, then people who suffer with an addiction can finally stop thinking of themselves as diseased.